Hi, I'm Tim Helming from DomainTools, and with me is Kyle Wilhoit, Senior Security Researcher, to chat this time about threat hunting.
Yep.
I know this is near and dear to your heart.
It is, yeah. It's somewhere I've spent a considerable amount of time in my career at. So, yeah.
So just in a real nutshell, kind of what is threat hunting referring to?
Well, threat hunting, the best way to think about it is proactive security. You're trying to get ahead of threats. You're trying to reduce what's called dwell time in your organization. So how long the attackers are actually operating in your environment. We're trying to reduce that by doing proactive hunting, looking in the environment, looking in the network that you work at, and trying to understand who the threats are, where they may be operating in your environment, where they've compromised, where are they possibly going to, and then proactively, ideally, blocking on what you find.
Gotcha. Yeah, there's the old joke about there are two kinds of organizations, the ones who discover they've been breached,
Yep.
and the ones who haven't discovered it yet.
And that's right. Yeah, completely
So,
right.
even if you haven't, it's smart to be sort of spring-loaded to assume that you have and go look for evidence.
Yeah, that's that common thing, that common saying is assume breach mentality,
Yep.
right? So automatically assume you've been breached, automatically go with the assumption that you've been breached, and proactively start to look and look for that badness, yeah.
So for organizations that are not threat hunting right now, it can be daunting, I think, to think about, like, how do I get started with this? It seems very complicated. It seems like a lot of advanced skills are required. Not everybody, has a Kyle at their resources. So how does a company get started?
The biggest piece is data. You have to have access to data in your organization, meaning log everything. If you have a SIM environment, log all your host-based logs, log network traffic, log block traffic on your firewalls or proxies or IDS, IPS. That's the biggest piece, is have that visibility into your traffic, into your network, into your hosts.
Mm-hmm.
Because of that allows hunters, incident responders, forensic analysts to go out and actually look at that data, look at those logs, and proactively hunt, ideally. So the biggest piece is that data, and the nice part about that is that it's free. Well, ideally it's free.
Because you've got it already.
You already
You've got
have that.
things generating it.
Exactly.
I know. I think of that as the fuel for the engine, right?
Yeah,
You can
that's a
build
good
this
way.
beautiful engine for analyzing stuff,
Yeah.
and if you don't have any fuel in the engine,
Yeah.
it just sits there.
That's a great idea. That's a great way to put it, actually. That's exactly right.
So there are a lot of different types of data that I can look at. What are some of the ones that that people can really get sink their teeth into quickly and readily that can already help them find evidence of something going on?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the first two recommendations I always make for any hunting program in its infancy is, first of all, drop logs on your firewall. So
Okay.
any communication going outbound that's being dropped on the firewall with a fairly high consistency is good low-hanging fruit, because then you can start to say, well, it's obviously being blocked for a reason. What is that reason? And then start to pivot from some of those indicators that you're finding.
And I'm just going to jump in there, and because there's something you said in there that's so important, logging your allowed traffic on the firewall. In my old days in the firewall business, you didn't log allowed traffic because there was so much of it, right? And also, it used to be assumed, well, if it's allowed outbound, who cares, right? That's probably people doing their business. But the reality is, that could be an indication. That could be one of your sources to actually get your teeth into something that's going on.
Absolutely, and the nice thing is data's cheap, or storage is cheap, rather.
Right.
So being able to pay for even logging those allowed logs is perfect, because
It's way
storage is
easier
cheap.
than it used to be.
Exactly.
Right, and
Much
the
easier.
bandwidth on the LAN side, 40 gig on the LAN side is not uncommon.
It's not uncommon anymore.
So
right.
that's not really an issue either.
Yeah, and ultimately you kind of get to the problem of it's a needle in a haystack at that point.
Right.
So it really comes down to knowing your environment, knowing and understanding where possible threats would be, where attackers would go at. So for instance, if you're running an operational technology environment, like SCADA environment, something like that, it's probably going to be a pretty high priority for an attacker to gain access to that environment.
Right.
So focus some effort in there, making sure that you're hunting on there proactively. Get on a dedicated schedule of having hunters look in those environments and proactively try to find stuff.
That's great. And so if a company doesn't have the budget or resources or whatever to hire a senior threat hunter like yourself, how does an individual who maybe is in incident response, or maybe they're one of the security folks, they're a security analyst, how do they start to turn that corner and become a threat hunter?
Yeah, that's a good question, and actually I'll use my own example as kind of a good roadmap. Personally, I started as a security engineer, deploying firewalls, deploying proxies, deploying IDS environments across the globe. That gave me a great fundamental understanding of how network traffic flows, how engineering principles are applied, how proper architecture is done. And that's a great foundation to go into hunting, because you have to understand traffic flow. You have to understand all of those kind of in-depth kind of concepts. So having that foundation is important. Network traffic, again, one of the big things. If you have a reverse engineering background, that also helps tremendously.
Yep.
Because from a hunting standpoint, you start with an indicator that's typically either a URL or IP,
Yep.
or a binary or file.
Yep.
And with that, having either of those skill sets as a good foundation is a great starting point. You're already on a good way, to getting to that point of being a hunter. So those are kind of the foundational skill sets that I would recommend, is fundamentally understanding architecture and engineering of information security, and or reverse engineering are
Great.
two great starting points.
Yeah, that's important. And network artifacts, it sounds like, are a great way for people to start to get involved with this. Let's
Definitely.
talk about the kind of information that an IP address or a domain
Yeah.
name, which you could find in those logs, could give you.
So honestly, from my perspective, whenever I'm hunting, that's one of the first things I look for, is domain or IP utilization.
Okay.
And I do that because that can give me a human element to tie back to more and additional infrastructure. Meaning if I have one domain, I could possibly pivot off of the name server and look for additional infrastructure that maybe that attacker is leveraging off of that same name server.
Right.
And that's just one example of being able to pivot off of one network indicator to be able to then go out and continually expand that infrastructure scope to, again, ideally proactively alert or log or block based on what you find.
Right, because chances are whoever's attacking you probably doesn't have just one IP address, one domain that they're throwing at you, right? They
Rarely,
probably got
yeah.
a whole ton of it.
Exactly, rarely. And ideally, if they made some operational security failures, you can tie that back to that other infrastructure. Meaning, I can find that one domain, find additional infrastructure behind that they're probably using.
So oftentimes they leak information that allows you to connect in, and so they didn't. If you wanted to practice perfect OPSEC as a bad guy, you would have one domain name that you used that was registered one way, and then you would have nothing else that ties that to anything else.
Exactly.
Completely different name servers, completely different registration info, etc. And frankly, they don't do that often, do they?
Nope. Cost, laziness, and possibly in some cases, not even understanding how investigators will actually go out and do those pivots and find those connections. So it kind of comes down to those three factors.
So these give, I hope, folks a lot of different ideas for how to get started with threat hunting. It is something that I think, what organizations should be thinking about doing this? Do you have to be a Fortune 50, mega big company to start doing threat hunting?
Not necessarily. And what I typically recommend is taking someone that has an interest in this. Maybe they're sitting in their SOC, right?
Mm-hmm.
Maybe they're an actual security engineer deploying firewalls. Mm-hmm. But if they have an interest in it, cultivate that interest, right? Get them trained in hunting. Have them go out and start to play in that area. And do you necessarily need to have them as a threat hunter 100% of the time? No, not at the beginning. But you can slowly integrate that in after you start to build out that program, after you start to mature those individuals and start to mature their capabilities. Then you can start to build that program out more naturally and organically. But at the beginning, take someone that's interested and cultivate that interest and grow that interest, because that's ultimately going to be someone that really has a stake in making sure that they're hunting properly in your organization.
So I think I've got it. When it comes to when an organization should sort of make the shift to this, it should be any day that starts with Y. No, that's wrong. I said it backwards. It should just be any day that ends with Y.
It should be any day.
Any day. All right. Well, Kyle Wilhoit, thanks again for joining us, and it's been a great chat as always.
Likewise, thanks.